Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Mess. So, taking another fun and exciting episode for you guys today because we're going to be taking a look at the Atomiswave. Just like Transformers, this thing is a Dreamcast in disguise. It's basically a one-to-one replication of Dreamcast hardware as an arcade version, and there are a ton of awesome exclusive games on this thing that you can run on Dreamcast, or if you're like me, you can run them on the Atomiswave in and of themselves. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe, and ring that notification bell, definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined to want to support the channel, you got a Patreon link down below as well. But the Atomiswave is a fun piece of arcade gaming hardware, and if you're a fan of the Sega Dreamcast or the Sega Naomi, you're going to have a ton of fun with this as well. There's so many awesome games on it, it is infinitely collectible, and I do know that there is a multi-cart in the works, at least at the time of this recording, and I can't wait for that to come out so I can have the entire Atomiswave library at the tip of my fingers. But something like King of Fighters Neo Wave here, my favorite version is on the Atomiswave, because once you get to the Xbox version, you get some weird filtering going on in some of the sprites, trying to make them look ever so slightly nicer. So for me, using the Atomiswave version still is the best way to play this game. Now, taking a look at the Atomiswave in and of itself, this is a very modular system. Pretty much everything can be plugged in and unplugged on the actual motherboard, blending it a very Dreamcast feel. You'll see here this game cartridge is missing the shell. That is relatively common on Atomiswave games, it just seems some don't come with them. So compared to something like the Dreamcast using the GD-ROM discs, this is going to use a solid state cart, and you're going to see all of these different flash chips here for the actual game in and of itself. Some areas will be unpopulated, it just depends on the size of the game, and then you have a couple other chips along for the ride. If you turn these things over, you will see more flash chips on the bottom, and there is another unpopulated area there for a fourth surface mount chip. So it just depends on how large they needed storage wise as to how many chips are on here. But this connector right here looks very familiar to Dreamcast. And again, the Atomiswave version of some games is just the better way to play. Obviously you get this nice Sammy Atomiswave billboard in the background of Neo Wave, and I do love that look right there. And that connector here is very similar to the GD-ROM connector on an actual Sega Dreamcast. This hardware is so derivative, it'll definitely make you recognize a lot of familiarities. And it is funny just how small the Atomiswave cartridges are compared to the Sega Naomi. These things are minuscule, but they carry the entire game along with them, and they are a fun thing to collect. Now, taking a look at the front, you can run this board in more than one ways. All of the power and all of the buttons are going to be on JAMA unless you need to use the expansion I/O board. But across here you're going to have different dip switches and different connectors for audio as well as video. Because this is a Dreamcast spec, it is going to do a variant of VGA out that we can use to get to 480p. It's not identical to what the Dreamcast does, but it's extremely similar. If you ever used anything like a VGA box, the Toro here, this is basically replicating everything across the board, except it's breaking it out into multiple ports versus just that RCA jack. But you can do 240p, you can do 480p across the Atomiswave. But we do also have the expansion I/O board on this board, and you're going to see multiple different connectors. I'll explain what they were for later on in the video, but I love that it just snaps in that cleanly. And that is the fun part about the Atomiswave. Kind of feels like a GameCube, or at least the underside of it, with all the expansion, and you get so many different connectors here for racing games, for light gun games. This is going to give you the ultimate ability to play whatever you want on your Atomiswave so long as you have everything hooked up, and they do pop in and out quite nicely. Now if we take a look around at the side, we're also going to have a network communication cartridge as well. Obviously the Dreamcast was a very online system, basically the first one that had online built in and intended to be used from day one. And on the Atomiswave board you can network these things together as well, but I don't have more than one board, so honestly for me it's just more of a curiosity. You don't even need to really run the thing with this in if you don't want to. And it's so interesting just to see how bare bones this board can be. It went from a fully built out show with all of the components to basically just a bunch of caverns and recesses. But as far as the I/O board is concerned, where Naomi is JVS, this is a completely different standard. It's basically hooking into the Maple bus as far as I'm understanding it. And if we take a look here at the actual board in and of itself, it is quite condensed, it is fun, and this is going to give you the ability to play basically anything you want. It seems like somebody's been in here in the past and reworked this a little bit. It does work on my unit, but there is some flux on that top right hand side corner. But this just extends the I/O out for games that need more buttons, games that have 3 and 4 player support, light gun games, and racing games in and of themselves. And because not every game is going to use this, something like Kenju here, you should have enough buttons on the JAMA edge that you can play this game perfectly fine. And also, if you never played Kenju before, you definitely owe it to yourself to check it out. And speaking of fighting games, the Atomiswave has a ton of absolute hits. Something like Fist of the North Star here is an absolute classic, and honestly, it's definitely something you should play. But really, you don't need much extra for this compared to something like Guilty Gear Isuka, which has a 3 and 4 player option. You would use the expansion IO. Sometimes games don't require it whatsoever. Something like Dolphin Blue here runs across the JAMA edge, and again, if you've never played this before, this is one of my favorite arcade games of all time. I absolutely love the look and the feel. It basically just feels like Metal Slug, except it's not actually in the Metal Slug universe. It is such a classic game. But some games are going to require special controllers. Something like Ranger Mission here, you definitely need to have a light gun or else it's not going to work whatsoever, and that's where all of those expansion ports come in to be able to actually allow you to hook these things up. But honestly, there's no one light gun game on the Atomiswave I think is worth hooking it all up for. Or something like Faster Than Speed here, a really fun arcade racing game. You're going to be using that expansion IO board to get your analog controls in for steering, for brake, for acceleration. So depending on what you want to play, if you're just getting into Atomiswave, you may need to be using that IO board, or you may never touch it. And around the back you get a fun barcode and a fan that sounds like a small passenger plane trying to take off. I've never modified this one because this just actually recently came in. Weirdly enough, I didn't have an Atomiswave that was working, so I picked another one up. Now, through the magic of editing, I've removed a metric crap ton of screws, and we can start getting into the actual Atomiswave in and of itself. But I will say this is a terrible disassembly process in its entirety. I disconnect the fan as well as that audio board right there, but the audio board is still on a standoff, and that is trapping the RF shielding from having to come out. So I've literally had to remove the standoffs, keeping that DB9 port in there so that I could actually take the RF shield out. This is not an easy dismantling process. Definitely don't try to get into this unless you're both willing to repair the board as well as competent at it, because there's a lot of stuff going on here, and I'll explain that in just a moment. If we take a look at the top side of the board, it's really the underside of the board because there really isn't anything up here except a couple connectors, some resistors, and a bodge wire. And the problem with something like this is, depending on how old they are, they're basically impossible to take apart with what I would consider damaging the actual board. Because if we take a look around at the side, all of the chips that make up a Dreamcast are fused to these metal pieces here to dissipate the heat into the chassis. Over time, these things basically become solidly glued, and trying to get the board off would probably just flex the chips and pop them the BGA array underneath. But honestly, you don't really need to see this board, because if you've ever seen the inside of a Dreamcast, it's basically the exact same thing. These same chips, the same amount of everything. This is just one-to-one a Dreamcast. So take a look at some fun Dreamcast shots, because I wasn't going to risk damaging the board trying to take something like that off. But the Atomiswave is great because it has games on it that never actually hit Dreamcast. You were not playing Metal Slug 6 on Dreamcast back in the day. Now, with CDRs or with a GDEMU drive, you can now play most of the Atomiswave games on Dreamcast, but I do know, and I did check, that some of them still have a little bit of a freezing issue. So honestly, I still think Atomiswave is the best way to play them, but I do love the fact that you can play these games on Dreamcast. And for a library that isn't huge, it has some absolute hits. Metal Slug 6 is a classic, maybe not as good as the Neo Geo games, but still amazing. Or something like Demolish Us here is an absolutely over-the-top beat-em-up game that kind of feels like a pseudo-sequel to something like Die Hard Arcade or Dynamite Deca on the Sega Naomi or Dreamcast. It's so much fun, it's so weird, and it never left the Atomiswave. I don't think there is a port of this game from memory, but I'm doing it from memory, so if I'm wrong, I'm sure I'll see it in the comments below. But again, another awesome game to play on Atomiswave, where you'll have stuff like King of Fighters 11, not my favorite entry in the franchise whatsoever, but still a fun game. But there's so many awesome games on the Atomiswave, you definitely should be checking it out. There's awesome beat-em-ups, awesome fighting games, racing games, you name it. The system has a good example of a game inside of it. But if there was one game and one game alone that I absolutely love playing time and time again on Atomiswave, it's gotta be Fist of the North Star. This is basically as good as Guilty Gear all day long, and I could have shown Guilty Gear in this video as well, but I just recently talked about that on the channel, so I figured I'd give Fist of the North Star just a little bit more breathing room, because this is not a game that I hear a ton of people mention, and it's absolutely one you should check out. Just be aware that if you are collecting Atomiswave games, for pretty much every high value game out there, the market is relatively flooded with bootlegs, so don't pay top price until you can confirm that cartridge is real. But the Atomiswave is just an arcade Dreamcast. Same specs, got a JAMA Edge, it has different games, but it is still just a one-to-one Dreamcast. So the Dreamcast was in disguise in arcades with the Atomiswave, and that's why I love collecting this hardware. I've got the Atomiswave, the Naomi 2, and the Dreamcast. It's my favorite 3D arcade platform of all time, that Dreamcast era. But short of that, if you have any questions, leave them down below. But we're done. Go play some Atomiswave, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.